On behalf of Aspen India and the German Marshall Fund for the United States, I welcome you all to today's session on global swing states, India and the international order. Aspen in India enjoys a very close relationship with the German Marshall Fund of the United States, which we value very much. As part of this engagement, we will be partnering again to host the trilateral forum on India, US, Europe later this year. We are honored to have with us Dr. Daniel Kleeman, Senior Advisor from the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and Ambassador Kamal Sibbal, former Foreign Secretary of India. Without taking much time, I would like to hand over to Mr. Daniel Twining, Senior Fellow for Asia, German Marshall Fund, who will be moderating the session. May I please request you to turn your phones on silent? Please also note that tea will be followed after the session. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Dan Twining. I run the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund, based in Washington. We're really delighted to be here with our friends from Aspen and all of you, and Ambassador Sibbal. I said when we found out that you could join us for this, I think I said in a slightly offhand way to one of my colleagues, well, I'm not sure he's going to agree with everything we have to say. And then it occurred to me that perhaps that's the point, because if we all agreed on everything, it would be very dull, and everyone would sit here thinking about tea for an hour rather than the subject at hand. So I'm delighted just to be here. We'll hear Dan out, and then we'll have a kind of structured conversation after Ambassador Sibbal responds. And then we'll open up the floor. Just very briefly to introduce, Ambassador Sibbal needs no introduction whatsoever, but to introduce my colleague Dan Kleeman. He's one of our really leading young strategists in the United States. In addition to this very interesting work on the global swing states, has done a set of activities around kind of strategic Asia, the future of liberal order, and where do big rising democracies fit into that? Where do existing democracies like Japan fit into the future of liberal order in the 21st century? A distinguished pedigree at CSIS and other institutions, the Center for New American Security, Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington. We'll hear from Dan without further ado, and then we'll pick up the conversation from there. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks to all of you for coming out today and to Aspen, India. I apologize for not having copies of the reports. I made it here to Delhi last night. My luggage sadly decided to stay in New Jersey, but you can download the report if you go Google Global Swing States. What I want to do in the next 10 minutes is give you kind of a high-level overview with implications for India, and then I'm very excited to get feedback and have a discussion. If you take away nothing else from this presentation, there are kind of three main points. First, that the international order, which has benefited most countries, including India, for the past 6 decades, confronts new challenges. Second, that India is one of 4 countries that are really pivotal to the future of the system, whether it fragments or whether it is reformed and renewed. And then third, for the United States, it's really critical to deepen partnerships with India and a handful of other rising power democracies to strengthen and sustain this system. Let me unpack each of those. We talk a lot about international order. What we really mean by that is a complex web that includes international institutions, but also alliances, strategic partnerships, informal networks. So it's more than just the UN or the IMF or the World Bank. We divide the international order into 5 main baskets. There's a trade piece, a financial piece, a maritime piece, a non-proliferation piece, and a human rights piece. Of course, there are other pillars of the international order, but we thought these 5 matter most. They're the most developed. But there, of course, are others that are emerging now. So environment, climate, how we govern the internet. This system, which was built after the Second World War and evolved over the last 6 decades, certainly has had imperfections and deviations. But overall, it's been a tremendous success. It's prevented great power war. We haven't seen anything like the conflicts that occurred in the first half of the 20th century. The order has facilitated a growth in cross-border trade and investment, which in turn has allowed an unprecedented increase in per capita incomes. At the same time, democracy has taken root in new quarters of the world where it had never previously flourished. So overall, the order has benefited most countries that wanted to engage with it. Today, though, we see this order is coming under pressure from a variety of areas. Some of these relate to elements of China's rise. So, for example, the growth of globally competitive Chinese state-owned enterprises has revealed gaps in the world trade system, which tends to very strictly divide trade between private companies and governments and can't really deal with what these new entities mean. Another area where China has pushed back on the international order is in the maritime arena with very large-scale claims in the South China Sea. But this is not all about China. If you took China away from the equation, there are other points of pressure on the system. On the trade side, the Doha round of trade talks is stalled, and we see a growth of trade agreements that are supposedly free, but often are very mixed in their quality. On the financial side, the financial crisis of 2008-2009 raised questions about the legitimacy of the global financial architecture in many quarters of the world. In the maritime arena, we see piracy reemerging, other states such as Turkey and Russia with expansionist maritime claims. Non-proliferation, I don't need to go into great detail. Iran, North Korea, both pose challenges to the non-proliferation order. And then lastly, on human rights, it's a mixed picture. The Arab Spring and the toppling of dictatorships is a positive trend, but overall, the number of democracies in the world has actually declined in the last 5 years. And then finally, with the retrenchment in Europe, the cutting of defense and foreign affairs spending there, fiscal pressures in the United States, the countries that have often provided the hard and soft power to underwrite this order are less and less able to do so. And so what we project in this report is potentially a fragmentation of the current order, where rules and norms that today are globally applied could be uneven across regions. And we see this as deeply inimical to really all countries, the United States, India, Europe, others, that depend upon an open system and a stable world. We see this challenge to the current system, though, as a real opportunity to renew it, to adapt it, especially by bringing in new core partners to support and adapt this system. We see countries with the most potential in this endeavor as having 4 characteristics. First, they should have large and growing economies because sustaining the international order and adapting it takes real resources. They should also have key geographies. They should either be at the center of a region or at the juncture of multiple regions, as this amplifies their influence. Third, they should be democratic. Now, this is not to say that democracies always see eye to eye. Certainly the US and India don't, the US and Europe don't either. But the current order is rules-based, and it's very difficult for democracies, for non-democracies to become core supporters. And then lastly, countries that are the most promising kind of new core partners in this endeavor today have mixed approaches to the international order, that they don't want to scrap it, but they do want to change certainly certain international institutions and also perhaps some of the rules. But they want to work within this system. And so using those 4 criteria, we identified India and also Brazil, Indonesia, and Turkey as really key emerging powers for the future of international order. We call India and these others global swing states. So part of this was myself, and Richard Fontaine from the Center for New American Security, my co-author, we were writing this report right before the US presidential election, and as hopefully good think tankers, we were trying to make a catchy term. But we also thought that the term global swing states really captured where India and these others are in the world today. In the US domestic context, swing states are those that promise the greatest return on investment to a presidential campaign because their orientation is mixed. They decisively shape an outcome, which is the election. Thankfully, American domestic politics is not the same or microcosm for world politics. But there are some similarities with swing states internationally and domestically. For India and these others, their orientation towards the international order is fluid. It's in flux. And so engaging them promises the most return on investment for the US or for other countries compared to countries with a more kind of fixed orientation. At the same time, collectively, India as well as Brazil, Indonesia, and Turkey bring the legitimacy and capability to either nudge the current system towards renewal or to nudge it perhaps towards fragmentation, depending on the choices that they make. And then lastly, India and certainly these others are really swinging between a more globally active role, taking on new international responsibilities, and also trying to deal with a host of domestic challenges, that they could swing towards a more globally oriented vision or towards something more inwardly inclined. And so all this is to say, we think India and these others are global swing states. This term is not to imply that India and these others are an emerging bloc. They're not. That India will work with these others closely. It's unlikely. Or that the US or other countries should engage India the same way they engage Brazil or the others. But we do think this framework is helpful, especially for American policymakers who are the kind of initial audience for the report, to really understand India's role in the world and not just sort of look at India through a kind of bilateral or regional prism. A lot of the report is trying to come up with creative ideas for how the US, India, and these others can work more effectively together to adapt and sustain international order. So I want to give you a flavor of those recommendations. There's not enough time to go into great detail now. We think it's critical to try to build out areas where India has already taken on new responsibilities. In some areas, the US and India simply don't agree. We can invest a lot of time trying to change that. Probably won't result in much in the short term. But there are areas where we might be able to move cooperation forward quickly, and through that actually change the overall tenor of our relationship. On the trade side, one policy we recommend is to try to work together to come up with a common framework for how to manage state-owned enterprises. It could be through the WTO, it could be through other international organizations, but this is an issue for Indian businesses. If you talk to them, it's an issue for American businesses, and so our interests are aligned here. On the financial side, India is increasingly active in Africa, both Indian corporations and the Indian government is a provider of development assistance. And so with India as an emerging donor, there's a real opportunity for the US to partner with India, whether it's at the government level or promote company-to-company cooperation, to promote development in Africa that balances certainly the kind of infrastructure needs, but also the political institution building needs that exist there. In the maritime arena, there are many opportunities for India and the US to partner together. At the least, we think it's critical to increase maritime planning and joint exercises to go beyond where we are today, and perhaps looking forward to have real defense industrial cooperation. So for example, a US-India initiative to develop a kind of cheap drone that could be used by the Indian Navy and Coast Guard and other regional navies and Coast Guards to develop a kind of common picture of the Indian Ocean where there are many non-state threats, which I think most countries certainly feel today. And then lastly, on human rights, it's critical for the US and India to work together to consolidate Burma's political opening. This is an area which is very much in India's strategic interest. It's in our common values, and India is already playing a role. There are opportunities to increase that even more. Part of US-India kind of a partnership to strengthen and adapt the international order, of course, has to be relating to international institutions. The US has already come out in support of an Indian permanent seat on a reformed Security Council, so there's not a lot more to do there, but we do think the US should continue to back UN reform generally and push for rapid implementation of reforms in the IMF that were agreed upon in 2010 but have yet to come about. A third area of engagement for the US and India relates to capacity. India, as well as these other global swing states, has arrived on the international stage, and sometimes faster than its domestic institutions have kept pace. And there are areas where the US may be able to help India realize its aspirations faster than it otherwise might. So we recommend, for example, increasing international military and education training funds for India, which currently are pretty low compared to other countries that actually are less strategically important to the United States today. Finally, the report looks internally. What can the US do to make sure it's a better partner for India? One of these things is basic, which is increasing resources devoted to programs involving India. A big part of our report was trying to make the case to the Hill, people on Capitol Hill, people in the executive branch, that look, the US should focus more on partners like India, especially partnerships that aren't fully developed yet. And so we think it's critical for greater investment in the US-India relationship. At the same time, we hope to create more programs for US officials to really be immersed in Indian politics, economics, and government. Although we have a common language, there aren't actually that many India experts in the US government yet, and so we think that's something that needs to be rectified. We need more human capital. So to take a step back from the sort of micro policies to the macro, how does this all fit into how the US and India operate in the world? We see coming together to strengthen the international order, whether it's India, Brazil, Indonesia, and Turkey, these global swing states, is really the best path forward in a world of increasing uncertainty. There are two areas I want to highlight. One of these is the future trajectory of China's rise. No one, I think including the Chinese, know whether as China becomes increasingly powerful, it will embrace most elements of the existing order except for democracy at home, or whether it may decide to really push back overall on the current system. In the best case, if the US, India, and these other global swing states can adapt and renew the international order, it will create a framework which will encourage China to use its power responsibly and create a world in which China can thrive and so can everyone else. In the worst case, though, if China does decide to really push back against the current system, coming together to strengthen and renew it will create a platform that can advance prosperity and peace despite whatever actions China might take. Lastly, the other area of uncertainty is the future path of American power. I'm an optimist. I think the U.S. has enormous long-term strengths, whether you look at innovation, demographics, and so I tend to be less worried about that, but there is a very vibrant debate in the United States, perhaps in India as well, about whether American power at least is in relative decline. Certainly if you fall into that school, then coming together to strengthen this network, this web, which is the international order, is ever more critical for the US, India, and these others to pursue their interests. So I want to close and just say the stakes are high, and this is very much a work in progress. So I'm very keen to get the ambassador's remarks, your remarks, and look forward to a vibrant discussion. Thank you.
Please, sir.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Twining, Mr. Kleeman, and Aspen, India, thank you for inviting me. Now I have to live up to my reputation and say something contrarian. Otherwise, you would all be disappointed. I've read Mr. Kleeman's report on the web, and there's much in it that I agree with, and some aspects of which need to be looked at a little more carefully to see if they are practical, doable, or if they fit in with India's views and thinking and priorities. Many assumptions in the report, to my mind, seem to be well-founded. Mr. Kleeman hasn't spelled out all the contents of his reports, but since I read it, I have noted some points where I can certainly agree without hesitation. One, that India seeks enhanced status. That's true. That India wants the international global institutions to be reformed. And this includes, of course, India's bid for permanent membership of the Security Council. Mr. Kleeman is absolutely right in saying that India is looking for change, reforms, not to do away with the present system or to scrap it, as he says. He also says in his report that no rival order can be created by any group of countries. I would agree with that too, notwithstanding China's rise. And he has questioned the consequences of China's rise, which he's mentioned here in his opening remarks also, and the impact that it may have on the current global order, whether China will seek to change its racket or adapt itself to it. Now, from the Indian point of view, some of the assumptions behind this report are objectively questionable. One, the presumption is that the existing international order is largely all right. It is sort of more or less perfect and needs to be tinkered around on the margins and adapted, tweaked and adapted a little bit here and there. And it would therefore form the kind of system that would be acceptable to everyone. I think it is not perfect by any means. I think it is obvious that the system is far too much dominated by the West, and they're not going to cede power easily, no matter what is said in public discourse. This is part of human nature, and nations are just an agglomeration of human beings. They're not going to yield power easily. Even in terms of reforms that seem to be obvious and necessary, that the present international order reflects the state of the world in 1945. And 68 years have, 45, and 68 years have elapsed, and it essentially remains the same. And despite talk for the last 10, 15 years of the need for change, and acceptance in principle that the system is no longer representative of today's realities, actual change on the ground is minimal. The UN Security Council expansion will not occur in the foreseeable future, although India has the support of Russia, France, Great Britain, and United States. I don't think that any of these countries is going to push for expansion. And would work on the premise that acceptance of India's quest for status, theoretically and in principle, would be sufficient to get things going, and hard decisions on this would not necessarily come about. It's not that the United States is the only obstacle. I think apart from China, there are a whole host of other countries in Europe and elsewhere which would not want an expansion of the permanent membership of the Security Council, which includes India. The World Bank and IMF will continue to be dominated by the West. The quota system is so designed that the United States, along with its Western partners in Japan, will have the veto. I can't see them modifying the quota system to the extent that would lift their veto. The fact that the US dollar is a reserve currency gives a huge advantage to the United States. In some ways, it is a guarantee of the existing financial system, but it carries with it a lot of uncertainties and problems, because a financial crisis in the United States then affects the rest of the world. When the dollar goes up, the world is worried. When the dollar goes down, the world is worried. When there's quantitative easing, there is concern. When there's tapering off of quantitative easing, then there is concern. So the global financial architecture and the manner in which the financial crisis occurred some years ago would show that we are far from having a system which is anything near perfect. One aspect of the current financial order, which is very important in relation to a specific issue that India faces, which is the US sanctions on Iran. India's position is that these are US laws. They don't have extraterritorial application, that India would abide only by UN sanctions. But in actual fact, the global financial system is so dominated by the United States that Indian companies, public sector or private sector, or even the government, is extremely hesitant to do anything which would violate US sanctions and not allow access to the US financial system, to our banking institutions and private companies and all that. This is the real power of the United States of America. In terms of the maritime order, again, the United States, though it is a strong proponent of maritime laws, freedom of navigation, et cetera, yet the United States is not a party to the law of the sea. So there is an inherent problem there. Now, insofar as non-proliferation is concerned, certainly from India's point of view, the India-US nuclear deal has removed this very, very key strategic issue which was marring our relations. But again, if you're talking about the global order, India would certainly have reservations on how the non-proliferation issue is treated when it comes to China, when it comes to Pakistan, when it comes to China-Pakistan collaboration, when it comes to Iran, for instance. And while I have no quarrel with the way the United States protects Israel's nuclear capability, politically I have no quarrel, but simply in terms of principles, there is an issue there. Similarly with regard to human rights, because these were four elements of the international order which Mr. Kleeman had identified in his report, certainly the fact that there is more awareness of the need to not to violate human rights, to preserve freedoms, basic freedoms, etc., etc. And there is a very genuine international reaction when there are cases where human rights are blatantly violated. Yet, in terms of how the international order works, there is a clear case of double standards, because in cases where human rights violations occur and are intrinsic to the system of governance itself, but if these countries are friendly towards the West, it is ignored. But if they are not friendly to the West, then this becomes an instrument in the hands of the United States and others to put pressure on those countries and name and shame them and try and delegitimize their governments. Then there's the issues with regard to the management of the existing order. Now, some can argue, and from India's point of view, and this is a viewpoint which we shared by many countries, that shouldn't the international order be based on respect for sovereignty? Shouldn't it be based on the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of countries? Shouldn't the system also exclude any regime change policies or any unilateralism, etc.? So now, for example, we see that the United States and France are openly declaring that if they don't get support in the United Nations for military action against Syria, they'll go it alone. Now, again, in terms of principles, does this reflect that the international order is working along principles which are equitable, fair, and justified? The whole business about responsibility to protect is being dealt with in a manner where certain regimes, certain countries get targeted. Then one issue which has been missing in Mr. Kleeman's report, and which is very important for a country like India and for the world in general, is the issue of terrorism and religious extremism, and how this has become a problem for the existing international order, and how the United States is handling this problem. From our point of view, there are again contradictions in the way the United States is handling this. For example, the United States is now, after having removed the Taliban from power in Afghanistan, the United States is now talking to the Taliban. And for us, the consequences in the medium and long term can be very serious if ideologies like this, which are in fact a huge threat to the United States itself, are not only tolerated but accommodated and given a share of power in Afghanistan. Similarly, the US-Saudi connection is a problem because, or the West-Saudi connection, because Saudi Arabia is the fount of really extremist ideologies all over, and we see that now in the Middle East, etc., and Qatar. Now, finally, a few words, because there's a lot I could say, but then we're going to have a discussion too. Is India comfortable at being identified as a swing state? I know this is, the phraseology has been thought of without any intention that it should become controversial in any way. It's well meant, but it is the United States perspective. And I think Mr. Kleeman has been very clear and honest and forthright in his report that the United States wants to preserve this international order. There are certain key states which can help the United States to achieve that objective. And India, Indonesia, Turkey, and Brazil have been identified as those. But I don't think India would feel comfortable at the idea of being a pawn in a larger strategic game of preserving the international order. I mean, at one time, a few years ago, India was described as a pole in a future multipolar order. So maybe that does that is better for the Indian ego to be, to be thought of as a pole rather than as a swing state, which means you can swing to the left, you can swing to the right, as the situation demands. Because inherent in this phraseology is that India will always have a limited status, a limited capacity to act by itself, and will only be an element in global strategy, which will be devised by powerful countries. Now, if China was to be described as a swing state, I would say, all right, I mean, we don't mind if we are called a swing state too. But if we are supposed to be a swing state in order to counter China, already we have accepted a status which certainly is not what we are seeking. There is a lot in the report which speaks about assuming global responsibility. And this is an argument that we have heard in many forums, that there are countries, including India, which are not assuming global responsibility for preserving the existing international order, which has benefited India and others, and therefore India is a free rider on the global system. Now, I do ask the question as to, when we are asked to assume global responsibility, what does it mean specifically? What does it mean specifically? In general terms, yes. Would that have meant that India should have supported the US and the West on Iraq, or on Libya, or on Syria, or on Iran, or on the US approach to religious terrorism, religious extremism, or terrorism, or the Taliban, or Pakistan, or oppose Putin and Russia? So what does it actually mean in practice? I'm not very clear. But it's not as if, or for that matter, supporting military interventions, because military interventions are never disinterested, never disinterested. No country, United States or otherwise, goes into another country militarily or attacks another country militarily merely because it wants to, or is motivated purely by altruistic motives. Now, if there are interests involved, then are those interests compatible with those of countries like India? And finally, China is a threat. We recognize it's a threat, it's a problem. But I think the country most responsible for the rise of China is the United States of America. And today, the kind of fusion there is between the United States and China, there is concern in countries like India whether the United States has the stomach and the capacity to actually confront China, contain China, hedge against China, because other interests of the United States in China are so deeply involved, that I can't see United States pursuing any robust policy towards China. It will be more a question of building some kind of barriers to Chinese power, especially if it is arbitrarily exercised. Now, and here I'll conclude, that India and the United States are cooperating already in the Indian Ocean. And I think this is something which strategically is very important, because the kind of exercises that we are having with the kind of platforms that take part in these exercises clearly show what the intention is. Certainly is not to deal with piracy or stuff like that, although this is what is said publicly. We have a trilateral US, India, Japan exercises now near Okinawa. We're going to have the second one next time. India has a big naval outreach to the Indian Ocean countries, right down to the African East Coast littoral. India-US defense relationship has expanded enormously in the strategic context, with $9 billion of Indian orders for high-class US platforms in the last 5-6 years. But the sort of things that Mr. Kleeman has mentioned about bolstering domestic capacity, to my mind, are not very significant. I mean, increasing IMET training to 4 million, which is given to Turkey, is neither here nor there. And I don't think India would be very enthused at this. He's also recommended quarterly meetings at the deputies level, and working group meetings at lower levels between India and the United States, and foreign policy professionals from India working in congressional offices in the United States. These are well-meant ideas motivated by genuine desire to help India build. I don't doubt that, but I'm afraid these won't fly. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador. That was really excellent. You fulfilled our prediction that you wouldn't agree with everything. You gave us quite a lot to talk about. In fact, much more than we can talk about over the next 15 or 20 minutes. So we're just going to have a quick sort of 10, 12, 14-minute conversation up here, which I will try to structure a little bit, and then we're going to open it up. I would just like to start. I'm not going to commentate. I'm going to open this with Dan. But just a question, prefaced by the comment, both of us, our GMF colleague Dhruva Jaishankar, want India to be a very strong pole in a multipolar world. I mean, I think the goodwill in the United States towards the rise of India is quite universal. The question, of course, that's on the table before us today is what kind of multipolar order will we all be living in? And the question for Dan is there another order that would somehow be better for India? I mean, this is not a question of US-India relations and kind of microcosmic issues in policy. It's really a question of, is there a different kind of international order that would fulfill more of Ambassador Sybil's and our ambitions for India to do well in the world than the broadly liberal order that exists today?
And so Dan probably already can anticipate my reaction, but I think an evolved and adapted version of today's order is by far the most likely order in which it's conducive to India playing a major role on the international stage. I mean, at the end of the day, the sort of institutions that were built after 1945 exist. It's very hard to create new ones. It's impossible to kill existing institutions. If you ask people in government, basically, once something's created, it's always on the map for them. And so if we were today to start from scratch and have kind of the countries that are relevant today in the room, it would be a different order. I'm not sure whether it would be better or worse for India, but I think we need to be realistic and recognize these institutions exist. They need to be reformed. I would add that already I think you're seeing the system change in a way that's conducive to India's role. You look at the G20, which was not influential until the financial crisis, a much more kind of equitable institution. If you look on climate change, the Major Economies Forum, which also includes India as well as many emerging powers, has emerged as sort of another important platform. And so I think more and more, especially as new issues enter the international arena, you'll see institutions that emerge around those that are much more pluralistic. So I do think, given what we have today, it's better to adapt and renew. If I was Indian, anyways, that's what my perspective would be, to adapt and renew the current system, because it's not possible to start from scratch, and so you have to take what exists.
Ambassador Sybil.
Well, I entirely agree with that. I don't think the existing international system can be changed, however imperfect or lopsided it may be. But it can be improved, it can be reformed, and some of the ideas already on the table will be reflected in your report. And I mentioned also what can be done. One, of course, is to reform the United Nations Security Council and the United Nations in general. India and Brazil and South Africa and Germany are candidates for an expanded Security Council. But there is this problem about the efficiency and efficacy of the UN Security Council. The United States doesn't want more than 21 Security Council members, whereas the minimum that the rest of the world needs are 26, so there's a huge gap. IMF, we've seen that in the last election, once again, the French former finance minister became the IMF Secretary General, although there was a candidate from Mexico or some country like that. The Europeans are totally unwilling to cede power. It may come, maybe China, next time the Chinese might be the IMF director. So in terms of the quota system, there may be some marginal changes here and there, but basically the West will not, plus Japan, will not give up their controlling power in the IMF. So far as G20 is concerned, already G20 has begun to lose steam. In the recent discussions in Moscow, everything was about Syria. One didn't really see too much about the real work of the G20 in creating a new financial architecture. India has some views in this regard, but these are you know, these don't change the fundamentals of the system. If the Prime Minister of India pleads that, when the West follows its unconventional financial policies, they should have in mind the interests of countries like India and the developing countries and the emerging countries. Now, this is the best that we can hope for, but there is no ability to change the basics of the system and the basic decisions that are taken by the West. Now, for example, you talked about capacity building, India's interests, this and that. Look at the kind of issues that are today dominating the India-US discourse. Companies which were in the forefront of wanting to build India had visions of large investment in India and entering the Indian market in a big way, whether it is Microsoft or IBM or this or that. Today, these corporates are the leading voices of creating negative sentiments towards India in the US Congress. For us, things like the new immigration bill, the outsourcing business, the H-1B visas, the steep rise on those visas, all these are issues which are dominating thinking here in our industry. What I mean is that when it comes to these hardcore bread and butter issues, there's not very much give at the political level in terms of general discourse. The right things can be said, but when it comes to actually pursuing policies which may involve an element of sacrifice on the part of countries concerned, it'll be very hard going.
Okay,
I would entirely agree, and I'll end there, that India would not want a system in which Chinese ideas begin to achieve importance or begin to dominate the system, because they're all the wrong ideas. They're all the wrong ideas. Therefore, we'll be much happier if the Western-built global architecture is preserved with the kind of changes that are necessary.
Thank you for bringing that up, because that segs right into the next segment here, which is that there are several alternatives to the broad liberal international order we live in today. One of them is a Chinese-led order. I think we've established amongst ourselves that neither India nor the United States would want such a thing. There is another alternative, though, which is a world in which the US draws back. I mean, you mentioned the drawdown from Afghanistan, kind of leaving the region to its own devices in ways that could be damaging to India. You suggested, many of us suggest, there are a few questions about the strength of the US pivot to Asia. Is it sustainable, or will the US slip into a kind of G2 dynamic with China again? But let's imagine that the US did retrench in really a fundamental way and drew out of South Asia, drew out of Afghanistan, drew out of the Middle East, walked away from danger zones like Syria, pulled back from Asia. Dan, would that be a better world, a kind of a world of chaos and anarchy, a world in which there was no leader? Would that be a better world in terms of the things I think we've all agreed that India wants as it rises?
I mean, clearly, from my perspective, it would be a much more unstable world. And the issue, when you look at, and I'm going to put my recovering academic hat on for just a second, so I hope you'll be understanding. If you look at sort of the rise and fall of powers for the last 100 years, unless there's sort of a power with very similar interests, ideals, and a kind of capacity to take over when one power retrenches, you tend to have chaos. And so you look at the UK's kind of retrenchment after World War I, the US was unwilling to really stand up, and you had the 1930s and World War II. And so historically, if sort of a country that provides global public goods steps down and no one steps up, it's bad for all countries. And at least today, if the US was to seriously retrench in Asia, the Middle East, there's no countries, I would say, with the interests and the resources and the values that could do it. I think India, 20, 30 years from now, who knows? But today, India, other countries that we call global swing states all have a lot of internal challenges, and there's no way that gap will be filled rapidly. And so I would see it as certainly very inimical to pretty much any country that values stability and common values that we have.
Ambassador Sybil, can I ask you a different question? You're welcome to pick up on this theme. But isn't there an argument, if you look at IBSA, India, Brazil, South Africa, if you look at the strategic breakthrough in US-India relations, if you look at the EU-India free trade agreement, if you look at this very strategic relationship India and Japan are building, isn't there an argument that India is in fact taking steps to shore up this broad liberal order by tying up with other big democracies, not in an ideological way, in a very pragmatic, self-interested way. But really out of a view that the weakening of Japan or Europe or the United States, the weakening of free trade, the sea lanes and other things that we jointly uphold, the collapse of an open international economy would fundamentally hurt India.
Well, it's a very complex situation, so it's not as if the choice is between black and white. There are areas in which India would value the continuation of U.S. Global role because it does provide a certain basic stability to the international system. But when the United States goes wrong in our perception, then there is scope for saying that we don't agree with certain aspects of U.S. policy. It doesn't have to be a situation where ideologically one simply disagrees with the United States. I don't think it's like that anymore. Number two, the kind of globalization that has taken place, the interdependence that is now there as a fact on the ground, means that the choices between countries are limited. And this globalization and interdependence has been a policy which is very consciously pushed by the United States of America, open markets and this and that. And the world has benefited from it, but there are other aspects to it which are problematic, and therefore those need to be addressed. My view would be that the situation is not where we have to visualize a complete retreat of US power or a complete domination of US power. I don't think that in actual fact this kind of a choice is going to be presented to us. But if the United States maintains the thinking and approach that it must remain the absolute dominant power and must not allow the rise of any country that can in the future challenge US power, then we have a difficult game in front of us, because then it's up to the United States to define what its interests are, and it can define them very broadly and it can define them more narrowly. I think the ideal would be if the United States would be willing to share power, define its interests a little more narrowly, believe more in multilateralism, not be, how should I say, dismayed when it can't have its way, when others stand in the way of the United States doing what it wants, et cetera, et cetera. More multilateralism, more respect for certain basic principles of living together, because when you have very strong power, ultimately it can do what it wants. Even in the case of Syria, if you attack Syria tomorrow, there's nothing Russia can do, frankly. It may leave some lasting traces in terms of how the world looks at the United States and how in future these countries must build up certain capacities to prevent this thing from recurring. But you can do it. So I would conclude by saying that given the fact that our relationship with the United States now has turned a very serious page in terms of actually beginning to have strategic understandings on several issues, and the bilateral atmosphere is very good. We do not anticipate or visualize the United States consciously working against India's interests. And therefore, it's in our interest to work with the United States and not counter US power and its influence unnecessarily. But where in specific areas it is against principles, it's against our interest, and against the regional interest, then we must be willing to say what we want to say and say that we don't have convergence in the United States on those issues.
Of course. Great. That's a nice way to open it up. Let's begin. Interventions, comments, questions, insults. Dr. Vermani. Great to see you.
Well, I really noted right from the beginning, which Ambassador also raised, the whole issue of terrorism was missing, which surprised me. But let me put it more concretely. As you must have read, one of the things we said about withdrawal, well, Hussein Haqqani, as you know, in the Foreign Affairs article has made the suggestion the US should just get out of and leave Pakistan alone. And maybe that'll be good for Pakistan and for everybody else. So that is one question. Just getting out of things is not necessarily always bad. as a former Prime Minister, Narasimha Rao used to say, sometimes making no decision is also a decision, by implying that it's a good decision. So getting out is not always bad. Well, many Indians may not agree with that, but I just want to get your views. The second one is, well, as you and many other countries have felt, the UN is not working. And people have been struggling to develop alternative institutions. So for example, WTO doesn't work. You're talking about TPP. Again, so the choice is not destroying the institution or trying to change it over 100 years. You can also build kind of parallel institutions. So I wasn't quite sure what you were saying.
Dan,
Sure.
reaction.
So where is terrorism? We thought when writing this report, it was important to, one, have a kind of positive focus, and the sort of terrorism pillar of the international order doesn't exist yet. And so I think it's important as a think tanker, you always want to leave something on the table for next time. We felt that was a very distinct issue from looking at the kind of 5 pillars that we set out. Get out of Pakistan. I had to smile. The sort of harshest critique we actually got on this report in the US was it made no mention of Pakistan, and some paper said we say, yes, India, drop Pakistan, which wasn't the message of the report. I think personally the US, Pakistan relationship, there's a lot of equities there. The US is not going to just sort of pull out. But the argument in this report broadly was that the US government spends a lot of time thinking about either competitors or kind of problems and not enough about opportunities. And India is really an opportunity from just a kind of American perspective, and therefore focus more on India relatively was very much the message. What about these kind of new institutions? You're absolutely right. To me, a key part of adapting this international order may well be coming up with new frameworks, and not that we should abandon the WTO or the IMF or any of these sort of post-1945 creations, but we shouldn't treat them as sacred cows either, and that you should figure out what works, and hopefully with, for example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, that those may actually eventually provide the building block for a large group of countries that could then raise it to the WTO when you get a higher quality global free trade agreement. So it's not a kind of zero-sum institutional game.
Who else? Yes, sir.
Okay, as far as I can tell, there are 2 levels at which I guess some Indians will have issues, and I think I would recast the points that Ambassador Sibal made. One is at the level of principle. Your argument seems to be based on the necessity of a hegemon for a stable international order. That's the argument of the public goods, Pax Britannica, now you need a Pax Americana and a modified Pax Americana. Could you come up with a path whereby the cost, what has become a problem is the costs of being a hegemon for the US have become a little too big, while the benefits are becoming more diffuse. The seigniorage for the international financial order may be sufficient, may not be sufficient. That's one side. So people talk about multilateralism, but even multilateralism, the way it has been practiced, has been dependent on an anchor, which the US has provided in the past, whether through international institutions or elsewhere. So is there a way to sort of diffuse it in a stable way? And I think that's really the crux of the debate at the principle level. On a more pragmatic level about India and actually all the swing states, is the US willing to to translate its principles to pragmatic things? And I'll just take the example that Ambassador Sibal made. The biggest trade issue between India and the US has been this issue of mobility of professionals, H-1B visas, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if the US government was as dysfunctional as the Indian, I could understand what was happening. But that's not so. When the US wants, what is a political edict does get translated into operational issues. That has not happened here, and that's not happened in a number of other operational areas. So one always wonders that in spite of all the sort of rhetoric of states, and I've heard this even from the Indonesians, I've heard it from the Brazilians, and I've not heard it from the Turks, but I've heard about the Turks complaining about the same thing. Is the US actually serious, or is this really more rhetoric to sort of counterbalance its deep strategic engagement and you could call it cultural ties with Europe. And that will remain the bedrock of the partnership there. And this cannot displace it.
Great question. So on the kind of domestic politics piece first, we may be in a race to the bottom to see who has more questionable domestic politics, U.S. or India. But I think you may give our politics more credit than it's due. You do see issues like immigration reform, which, frankly, the India issue is a side piece. In domestic politics, it's very much about.
It should be a non-issue.
Yeah, and so I think it's domestic political dysfunction. It's not an issue of seriousness. There's very much seriousness on the U.S., at least the executive branch side, and the issue is kind of dysfunctional parliamentarian politics in the U.S. On that. In terms of, is this an argument for propping up U.S. hegemony? Absolutely not. I mean, the international order is not the same as U.S. hegemony. The whole idea is you adapt it, you change it. There are sort of overarching principles, but in terms of beyond that, not so much. And so I did want to sort of point out a few ways we thought going forward which might work. So, for example, the role of regional institutions, that you see more and more robust kind of regional organizations evolving. Sometimes they include the U.S., sometimes not. Often they're playing a very constructive role, and from our perspective, that's shoring up and it's strengthening the current system. Or even cases like, for example, Brazil working within the IMF to reinterpret laws on capital controls. Something that I think U.S. policymakers opposed in terms of they didn't want to see that happen, but it was within the system. It was evolving through negotiation, and so that's actually, from our perspective in the report, strengthening and adapting the international order.
Okay, can we take a final round? Can we go here, please?
No, while I completely agree with Ambassador's analysis of the U.S. foreign policy, there's also a need to get into the idea of the nature of democracy in the United States itself, because much of the rhetorical legitimacy that United States draws in terms of its extending its foreign policy is to say that it's a great democracy. I mean, I was only wondering that how could it be a great democracy when majority of the population continue to protest against American intervention in Syria, as it did against their intervention in Iraq. But the U.S. just goes ahead. I mean, President Obama said that even if Congress was to vote against, United States intervention into Syria, it would still go ahead and intervene.
We're on the subject of global swing states.
Yeah.
Can we just pass? We're out of time.
I'm trying to link the idea that the democracy in United States itself is based on some kind of social Darwinism. So it has some link with its nature of its foreign policy. So this idea that United States continues to be a great democracy itself, perhaps we need to revisit in the current international order.
Could you just pass the mic because we're just out of time? Could I just say 77 American senators voted to support the invasion of Iraq?
I read your report with much interest. It reminds me of a book which came out by one investment banker called Ruchir Sharma, who talks about breakout nations. And he gives about another 6-7 more countries to watch out for, and out of them, 3 are, to my mind, become very important. Those are Nigeria, South Korea, and South Africa. Would you also consider them as swing states? Although I don't like the term swing because it has different connotations altogether.
Okay, can we just take 2 more and then bundle, and we can both respond at the end? Yeah, we have you here, and then you, sir. Yes.
Hi, my question is predominantly for Ambassador Sybil. I'm hoping you can comment on India's preparedness to intervene in the international system, or for that...
Sorry,
India's preparedness to intervene in the international system, or for that matter, into other states for the sake of values and rights of individuals. So India has recently voted against Sri Lanka on a number of human rights resolutions, and I think the initial resolution within the UN on Syria, India voted for, but has stepped back from the international action on Syria at the moment. So if you can comment on that, that'd be appreciated.
Okay, and then here in the white shirt, please. We'll wrap up then with the panel. Just here, please.
I just wish to make a small comment on an idea or a concept introduced by the United States to the Bretton Woods order, and that was the Washington Consensus. After the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the USSR, the United States came, or many policymakers and academics, that market and market democracy go together, and that it ultimately led, in my opinion, and I can show you various writings of policymakers who thought that intervention, armed intervention, to bring about democracy, like let's say in Iraq, would be a good thing because such an intervention would produce both market economy and later lead to democracy. Now, same thing is at work in various countries. Do you believe that this is a dangerous idea to, first of all, a completely ill thought out philosophical concept that market and democracy go together?
Okay.
They don't, you know.
Okay, they do in India and the United States, but why don't
They
we just
don't
take,
in China.
Ambassador Sybil, could you
They
just
don't
take
in
could you just
Singapore.
take the intervention question, and then Dan can wrap up?
Well, basically, we are not in favor of intervention. But of course, if I said that, somebody will remind me that you intervened in Bangladesh and you intervened in Sri Lanka. So one can't say that we make an ideological fetish of it. It depends on the circumstances of the situation and how it affects the interests of the country in which we intervene, the end result, the outcome, and how it might affect our own interests. I think we intervened in Bangladesh, and Bangladesh has done rather well, unlike in Iraq, which is not doing well. Neither is Libya. Tomorrow, Syria may not. In Sri Lanka, we intervened, but we paid a price for it. We accepted the folly of intervention. And after that, in fact, we have bound our own hands ourselves and not played any proactive diplomatic role that India, as the neighbor of Sri Lanka, should have played. We allowed the Norwegians and the Japanese and others over the years to try and resolve the Sri Lankan question. It is because our bilateral efforts with Sri Lanka to move forward on the Tamilian question didn't succeed as well as we might have wanted. And Rajapaksa is a very clever politician, very difficult to deal with, and we had pressure from our Tamil Nadu state itself that for purely actually we have ample means to do so, but we didn't do so. In the case of Syria, we supported the resolution that was passed, which had the support of the United States and China too, Russia and China too. So there is a general disinclination of India to support armed military interventions for the sake of responsibility to protect or regime change or terrorism or non-proliferation reasons. But certainly we're not allowed that to affect our bilateral relations with the United States. And despite the fact we differ on these issues, we have maintained a certain degree of cordiality, of disagreement with the United States on these issues.
Thank you. Dan.
So briefly on the what about other countries question, some have accused us of picking countries based on good places to visit, great cuisines. If that was true, South Africa would absolutely have been on the list. So it was not. I think the countries that you mentioned, Nigeria, South Korea, South Africa, are sort of fundamentally distinct from what we call global swing states. And which, again, it's a term that as think tankers we use. The U.S. government, I doubt, will use it. We're certainly not expecting anyone else to use it, but we think it's a helpful framework. Nigeria, country with enormous domestic problems. South Africa, about half the size in terms of GDP of the largest or the smallest of these global swing states. One of several kind of African heavyweights and a very uneven player on international issues. South Korea has swung. In a way, it's kind of a good poster for what a kind of swing state might become, where they now play a huge role when it comes to, for example, being a donor in the world. They're involved in Central America as a donor, who would think? And so, to me, those countries are just very different from the four that we highlight. I just want to sort of close with my final remark in terms of the recommendations here. They vary very much in scale, and you're absolutely right. Some are small, some are larger. In some ways, I think the U.S.-India nuclear deal primed certainly Americans, and I think also Indians, to kind of expect what's the next major objective. And in reality, we removed a major obstacle, and perhaps the coming years, it's really about how do we piece by piece build a much larger partnership. And there are many steps towards what will be a tremendous outcome, and we should keep that in mind. Thank you.
May I make one point very briefly? which is in regard to China, because that is very much there in the background in your report, because the challenge to the existing system will come from China, and countries like India are swing states in terms also of trying to checkmate China and its deleterious influence on the international system. But India's conduct needs to be analyzed in a little more sophisticated manner. We are, in fact, trying to find, as much as possible, convergences with China. Our trade with China has grown enormously to the point it became our largest trading partner in goods. Now we are looking for Chinese investments in India. Our corporate sector is taking a hard look at China and trying to benefit from the huge financial resources at its command. In climate change issues, WTO issues, we are cooperating with China because we find that we are both on the same side. We are maintaining a very high-level dialogue with China. Leaders are meeting very, very frequently. I think at the end of it, we feel that we'll have to manage the global system in a manner where China will need to be accommodated, and it can be dealt with in two ways. One, our bilateral dealing with China in order to limit the threat from China by engaging it positively. And secondly, would of course be relying on the United States and others, and Japan, you mentioned Japan, to see what can we do in order to build barriers against China. It's a very difficult, very complex game, which the United States itself is not able to play with any cohesion, with any clarity. And since you don't have cohesion and clarity, we have to draw the lessons from it.
So I think we'll close with just the thought that maybe just speaking for Dan and myself on the global swing states idea is that our robust view, I think, is that a liberal international order will better manage to accommodate, integrate, manage, and shape China's future trajectory than would a fundamentally different kind. So why don't we leave it there and say thanks to Aspen, thanks to the panel, and we'll see you for some coffee and tea in the back. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was great.
Fun.
Very good. Thank you. This was excellent. Thank you.